Okay, what we're going to be doing here is doing 6 different joints in succession. So this will be the video number 1. What I wanted to start with is just a reminder of how to set up the Dado stack. Remember that this nut on the, let me see if I can actually point this out, right down here, because the blade spins this way, remember that this is a left-hand thread nut, which means it's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, what you guys normally go for, but it's lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. Just because of the direction of the threads, if it was in the normal way, as the blade had a little bit of tension, it would unthread the bolt, making it loose. In this way, since they've backwards threaded or left-hand threaded it, what they've allowed it to do is as the blade possibly slips on the shaft, it will, if it causes this nut to move at all, it will only cause it to get tighter. It's a safety feature, but it's also a very frustrating thing if you don't know that and you go to take a blade off a table saw. You're just tightening it up beyond all belief, and it's really frustrating. So table saw blades on the actual shaft that it's on, the threaded rod, is a left-hand thread. So turn it the opposite way to remove it. Alrighty. So what we're going to get into are these 6 different joints that we're going to cover, and I will label each one as we go forward. So this one is the Dado. Hopefully that's not backwards. That'll be funny if it's backwards. All right, a dado is a very simple thing. You put a groove in one piece of wood, the same size as the piece of wood that's going in there, boom, she slots in. In order to do this safely, what we have to do is put a fence on top to make sure we don't run our hands across. Because in order to run a dado, you've got to have the blade open on the top, and that is no mas. No bueno. It's no bueno. All right, so what we do is we're going to put a couple of pieces of wood down as a spacer. Just follow along. You put a nice little thin strip of veneer to give a little bit of a space between the distance that wood's going to be raised and this block of wood. The block of wood is going to act as a roof, shield, a hood, a barrier between your fingers and the blade. Make sure she's in place, she's nice and square. And now we can remove these pieces of wood, and when we, with our push stick, run this through, we can't touch the blade. It's perfect. And this won't jump up. The other thing is we make sure that we know that this is where it's going to be. We're just going to estimate it right now. So I want to show you. Smooth surface. Put this right in the middle right there. That'll roughly be where we need it to go. All right, now I've set the blade width, the Dado stack, at 3/4 of an inch. And just for clarity and for ease, all these pieces that we're going to be making these different joints out of are 3/4 of an inch thick. It's all pre-milled. So here's what we do. 3/4 of an inch. We're going to cut a 3/4 of an inch groove. We turn this on. And in fact, I'm going to use 2 push sticks because I'm that way. There we go. There's our groove. We didn't go too high. There's our groove. You can make it as deep as you want, right? So we just wanted to make a small little groove. And then this sits inside there. You glue that in place, and the deeper the groove, the more it's going to have surface area in the bottom of that V, or that channel, to be glued on the bottom and the 2 sides. So you can set this really deep inset. Now you can use this for a shelf and a lot of different things. And well, it'll be up to you where you apply these joints. The goal of these exercises is to learn how to make the joints, and then your creativity comes into play and says, wait a minute, I know I need to join these 2 pieces of wood right here. I got something for that. And that's the point of all of this. That's a dado. It's a very simple thing. Now, we're going to jump right onto the second one, and this one is called a rabbet. Okay? Hopefully that's not backwards, which I fear it is. Now, a rabbet is only slightly different. A rabbet is exactly the same thing as a dado. And let's raise the blade just a bit because we're going to be a bit saucy. We're going to take, there's the dado. We're going to put that aside. Number 1 done. Then we're going to take the rabbet. A rabbet is a dado on the edge of the wood. That's it. So what we're going to have to do is line this up with the edge 3/4 of an inch in. In fact, we're going to have to reset this. Now that we know how to do it, it's not a big deal. We're going to set this piece of wood in up on the edge to the edge of the blade. There's a couple of ways that we can do this. We can just use that piece of wood that's 3/4 of an inch wide and set the fence like that, or we can use measuring devices and a little something we like to call a ruler, tiny little thing. We'll set that to 3/4 of an inch to the fence, and I think that would be the best idea. Oh, from there. There. Edge of the fence to the left side of the blade is 3/4 of an inch. Then we'll set these 2 blocks back in place. Our little spacing veneer on top. Our block that we'll put the handle on the other side this time because that is the smart thing to do. Good. Now we've got our roof to protect our fingers. We take our piece of wood. Let's turn this back on. Simple. Oh, see, it was a little bit off. That's okay. It was so small we could just break that off. So the fine-tune adjustments are good. So we have it on the edge, and this sits right there. So you can see that the distance, the thickness of this wood is a bit off because I set it to 3/4 of an inch. These were pre-cut by students, so I just grabbed from stock. But that's the way it works. And you can see that this might be something for a drawer or maybe a shelf, maybe the top shelf, maybe the top of that cabinet that you're making, or the top of that bookshelf that you're making, where the top sitting on top of the wood. It gives you 2 surfaces to glue to, and it helps you align things squarely. It's very handy and very simple. So there are the first 2. That's the Dado, and that is the Rabbet. Probably the 2 first ones that you're going to learn after the 2 very simplest ones, which is the butt joint, which is take 2 pieces of wood, glue them together this way. Super weak, only slightly more weak than a 45-degree joint, like so, like a picture frame. Okay, cut them on a 45-degree angle, and then 2 45s equal to 90. Now you can do multiple angles, you can do a bunch of different angles, but you'll end up getting different shapes other than a square. So those are butt jointed together. Now there are tools that you can use. One is called a biscuit joiner. Again, that's something that we don't have yet, but a biscuit joiner does something that is very, very handy for keeping things like a miter joint nice and square, or not square, but nice and strong. It makes a small little slice, a little cut, about half the shape of a football, into each surface. Now the way you set up this machine will allow you to put them in the exact correct spot. But then what you do is you take this little wafer that is like a football itself. I wish I had some on hand, but I don't. Like I said, we don't have them. But maybe I'll attach a video of this in this video. So look to the side of the screen for the link, so you can see what a biscuit looks like in a biscuit cutter. So it'll let you make a 45-degree joint, and putting a piece of wood that bridges between this side and this side, it's kind of an internal dowel that you can't see. It's like a blind dowel you can't see. It's actually quite strong. And the biscuits are made of compressed hardwood. So when the glue that you put in that groove and on that biscuit, when that piece of hardwood soaks up the glue, it swells up, fills that cavity, and then completely seals up everything in there. It is a really interesting joint, very handy. They're kind of popular in some circles. Some people don't like them at all because there's much more fancy ways of doing things. But that is like a blind plug. Another method, which is our next method of doing something like that, is called a spline. Now, a biscuit is a small little football-shaped, very thin but very football, oval-shaped cookie type of thing that fits in that slot that you cut on both surfaces. A spline is just a single groove. It's a really thin dado. Okay, it's a very thin dado. And what you do with that, you take a piece of wood and you cut it in you cut a groove the length of however, how long the piece is, but on both surfaces. And just like a biscuit, you're cutting a groove on each surface. Then you take this piece of wood that is the same thickness as that groove is wide, you insert this in one side, then you put this in the other, and then you've got this piece of wood, this spline, that's inside the wood, but it runs the entire length of the wood. It's basically a roided up biscuit because it runs the entire length. It's very, very strong. It's much better than the butt joint, but there is one small problem with that. The biscuits are compressed hardwood, so they've got the fibers of the biscuit are running in every different direction. I believe they're made of pulp, right? So they've got fibers that are crisscrossing. If you take a standard piece of wood, how you're going to mill it is probably going to be lengthwise, which means that the pieces of wood that you're joining together along that fault line will run the same direction as the grain of wood. And just because you have material that runs across is not the only thing you should consider. The piece that is the spline itself is thin and can snap because you're snapping along the grain. You're not having it reinforced across the grain. If you could have a spline that ran the opposite direction so that your wood being spliced, or the two pieces that you're splining together, have the wood running with the spline having the grain running in the opposite direction, it's much more difficult to break the wood this way than it is that way. So direction of grain matters. But regardless, you'll still have material that is bridging across two surfaces and held in place by the polymers in the glue. So it will be not as strong as a cross grain, but it's still quite strong. Okay, so that's the first three. First one was the Dado, then was the Rabbet, and then we went to the spline. The next one we're going to cover, so let's get that was the spline, and put that spline out of the way. That's 3 out of 6 that we're covering today. Well, actually 8, because we said we're gonna cover the butt joint, simple, throwaway one, and the miter, picture frames, but how heavy is a picture? The next one we're gonna be doing is called a lap joint. Now, a lap joint is basically a really, 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 really wide rabbet, because the way it's going to work is we are going to take we're going to make 2 rabbets very, very wide that coincide with the piece of wood that we're matching it to. So if we take a look, say we're going to make a very strong corner on a picture frame. Instead of the miter joint, we want something really beefy, really strong. And make a line there, make a line there. So what we've done is we've made a square on the end of this. We're going to remove some material on this piece right here and do the same thing right here, to the thickness of half on each. See, what we're going to do is we're going to remove this to this line, to this line, and to this line. Okay? So what this is going to look like is there'll be a full piece of material here. It'll step down and have a tongue on the end of it. Let me do the first one and I'll show you. And the way we set this up is we reset our safety jig here. We're going to set this up to the maximum. Whoops, wrong side. Let's go this way. Alrighty, that should do there. And then we're going to take a thickness, take a measurement of the thickness of this wood. Let's be accurate, shall we? So it says 3/4, but it's a shade under 3/4. So we're going to lift this up. I'm going to use my height gauge to raise up the blade. So we had 3/4, so we want to go to 3/8. And in fact, a shade under. That's good. All right. So now we are going to have to get a wider piece of material. You know what? I think I'm going to lower that down a bit. Alrighty. We're going to use push sticks instead. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the sled on here. And we're going to do that from the top. My apologies for having this video run a bit longer than I expected, but you know, I was about to do something for expediency's sake and say, well, I know it's dangerous, but I just need to show this real quick. We like to call those famous last words. So here we go. Now we've got the sled. Now we're talking. So now what we need to do is have a stop block and put it over here. And this way we'll be much, much safer. I'm feeling better about this decision by the second. There we go. We'll set this stop block in place. Oh, goodness me. What was I thinking, eh? We have this device. We didn't want to use it. So now we just got to raise the blade a bit more and go 3/4 off of the deck of our sled. There we go. That's easy enough to do. There. Alrighty, so now all I have to do, I put this in here. My hand is secure. I can't fall into the blade, and this is not going to shoot anything back at my face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the first cut and then slowly move it back. So I'm going to make the first cut here, and then cut, 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 cut. And then do that exactly the same thing to the other piece. Now the fine tuning might have to be done, but once you've got something set up, like the stations we referred to yesterday, the stations around a facility where you might be working and making things, once you get the first template piece, the first pattern piece in place, all your tools are set up. You don't have to readjust them. You just set them up perfectly and you run 1,000 of them a day. Once it's perfect, it's good. You check them every once in a while, and when they go out of square or out of size, make adjustments, get back to work. So here we go, getting back to work. Let's do the other one. And we've got the second one. And look at that. I don't even have to mark the second one. Okay, now if the height was off or the depth was off, then I'll have to make some adjustments. But essentially you'll get the idea. So you see now I've got the step on one and the step on the other. So when I match these, they go together like so. Or I can put them on a corner. And then look at all that gluing surface. But the benefit of this is that this, when adjusted correctly, is flush. And you've got a nice square corner that's extremely strong, okay? Now you can do this here, or you can treat it like a dado as well and put it in the middle of a piece, making a very strong lap joint that is nice and flush. And I'll leave it to you to discover exactly where you might use something like that. So there's the 18-minute mark. We've got 2 more to go. I'm gonna set up for the finger joint and the mortise and tenon, and I'll see you at the next video. All right, welcome back. And now we are going to take care of what we call the finger joint. Now, the way a finger joint works is very, very easy, but it looks complicated in the beginning, just because of the spacers. And what spacer do I use and where do I send it up? Well, here's how it works. I've got this jig right here, and I'm sure you could buy finger joint jigs, but these are just equally spaced blocks. I mean, these are very specifically sized blocks. Now, I've got a tray of them here. You may have seen them in the shop. And what the purpose of these are and the arrows on them, they are designed to move this block that I'm cutting the fingers into. And let me show you what the finger joint looks like after we're done cutting. So you can see you've got to pass it through the blade once, then space, then block, then space, then cut. So you have to make sure that these spaces are in the specific spots so that when it goes together like that, making a very strong joint. Now, this is the second strongest box joint you can actually make. The other type that we're not going to go into detail about is the dovetail joint. And that is stronger for a very specific reason that a video later today will instruct you. But this is very strong, mostly because of the increased amount of surface area that you can glue together. Okay? And when you fine tune this is not exactly fine tuned, but when you fine tune this, it gets pretty tight and it's very strong. When you get all the glue operating on different surfaces, it's very tough to take it apart. But it doesn't have mechanical strength, it has surface and glue tension, and that's a thing all in and of itself. So we got our two pieces. And the way this works, it's very simple. I'm gonna cut this whole thing right in front of you. I've set this stop block up. I'm not going into too much detail because the better idea would be for you to be here, obviously, and you will be in the future. But just know this, once you set your stop block, it doesn't change from one piece to the next. And I've got the stop block set right over here. This piece goes right up against the stop block. And the first pass, well, let's make sure that these two pieces are the same length. They are not. So let's make them the same length. You'll hear the whine. I'd be there sooner, but I'm waiting for the blade to stop spinning before I walk away. Ha-ha. Now they're the same length. So now, I put this stop block in place, which really lets me put it right at the beginning of where the cut's supposed to be. I put these blocks in a very specific order, and going into too much detail doesn't really help you out right now. It's too confusing. But there is two different size blocks. One block will move it one space over, and the other block is twice as wide, which will move it two spaces over. And using these blocks in the correct order will allow you to take those two pieces of wood offset by one of those teeth, one tooth over. And if I lay these up side by side, what you'll see is they are laid across and they've been pushed over exactly one tooth so that when you put them together, they just mesh. Okay? And we put these blocks in there just like this. So first block goes in to move it over two spaces. We firmly hold that in place, and all this, the height is set. We go one, put another block in, moving over to two spaces. And another full block, moving it over two spaces. And one final block, and depending on how long your piece is, you might have to move this over quite a lot. So be it. Now that's the first piece. For the matching piece, you move it over the very first time halfway. So use the half block. And we'll do the second piece. Put the second piece in there. Move it over halfway. Leaving that halfway block in place, then move it double. Now we're just moving the same distance each time. And I think that brings us to the end. It does. See, that brings us to the end. What we now have are two pieces that go together. Ooh, tighter than the first time. There we go. Now that's just rough cutting. When you get really fine-tuned, because when you're working with hardwoods, you'd end up splitting it. Actually, I forced this one just a little bit and I broke a tooth. Oh no, which is very easy to do because of how the grain runs. So there is your finger joint. Only it is the less complex, simpler version of a dado. Not a dado. Dovetail. Starts with a D. I was confused. Last thing we're going to do is I'm going to go get set up for the mortise and tenon. Alrighty, I'm set up. What I've done here is I just grabbed a couple of pieces of wood that I had laying around the shop. I'm going to make the mortise and the tenon. The tenon is the tab, mortise is the hole. Okay, it's square holes. What we're going to be using is the dado saw here and the mortising machine. So you'll be walking through the shop with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a skill we just kind of learned. We are going to put a rabbet on the end of this, but we're going to put it on all four sides. I've set this stop block up to be, well, 3/4 of an inch wide. So that's how deep our hole's going to be. And the reason I set it up for 3/4 of an inch wide is I don't want to have to make multiple passes. I'm just going to make one pass to make this nice and simple. Let me show you what it looks like to have a rabbet on the end of a piece of wood on all four sides, making what we called a tenon. So now what we have is a tab, tenon, a tab. See how we've taken some off the shoulder? Now I'm going to make one on the opposite end. This was for dramatic purposes to make it nice and bold. I'm only going to take a little bit off. And the purpose of this shoulder is, since the hole is only going to be the size of the tab over there, then when we pound this into the wood, putting it into the hole, lots of surface area for the glue to adhere to, lots of strength, but you can't see the hole, because this perfectly milled lip, this shoulder, is hiding the hole. So it's a blind dowel, another blind dowel, but it's really crazy strong. I mean, you could put this in leg braces for the bottom of legs going into the bottom of a table, lots of different ideas. You have to be the creative one to find out where to place these joints. So I'm going to make this a little bit less bold and cut it on the opposite side, and then we'll walk over to the mortising machine. See, a little less bold. Still be able to hide that that shoulder. Will still be able to hide that that hole that we are going to make right now. So follow me over here. And what I hope you realize is sometimes you can combine the skills that you've learned individually, one tool to the next, one joint to the next, put them together, and not only discover that you can get extremely quality results, but attractive results as well. So now we've got our pencil. We're going to find any old place on here. Let's use our square to line it up just right. Okay, let's line it up with this right here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where the hole is. Keeping in mind, I don't want this hole too big. So what I have to do is leave the pencil line, because the pencil line is very important to listen to. If I cut outside the pencil line, the hole's too big and then the joint is very, very sloppy. So now, I'm going to position this in place, and I will drill my square holes. Now, what we can do is we can set the depth of this to exactly 3/4, so it doesn't go all the way through. We don't want the hole to be this huge empty cavity, then you get a hole in your piece that doesn't really work that well. So if we set it to just enough so that it seats itself perfectly, the glue will fill up the bottom, the sides, all the way around and be very good. If you've got this open cavity, well, that's a weak spot and it's unnecessary. If you make it too shallow, then the tenon will not seat itself properly in the hole. So paying attention to the depth is very important. Don't go too shallow and don't go too deep, but stay within the pencil lines. This is a very cool machine. Right there, inside the pencil line. What I like about this machine is it's fully articulating forwards and backwards and left and right. So here we go. Moving it over just a bit. Good. And now, There we go, move it back. We'll close that down. Let's use our pencil to clear that hole out of there. In fact, I got one more idea. I don't want to get a sliver. Let's check the depth. Not quite big enough yet, and I still think we'll probably have to go deeper as well. Let's adjust the stop on this. Oh. Well, you know what? I think you get the point. I'm not going to bore you to tears with this. Let's just simply make the hole bigger, even though it won't seat itself quite yet. Take that out of there. And what we're left with is, a pretty snug tenon, just not deep enough. Adjusting this machine is adjusting this rod, and I don't have that Allen key on me, and I don't want to bore you to tears with going to fetch it. So it's basically just letting it go down a little bit further. And then you've got a mortise and tenon. Square hole, square tab, insert one into the other. And that is it. That is the 6 different joints for the day. And if you really were counting, there was actually 8.